Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, South Africans are hit with another round of load shedding. Homes and businesses are plunged into darkness once again as beleaguered state power company Eskom continues to struggle. Also, in a tragic reminder of the lengths to which some will go to make it into Europe, the body of a young boy is found in the undercarriage of a plane that arrived in Paris from Ivory Coast. And in Kenya, most plastic waste ends up in landfills. Some campaigners who believe prevention is better than a cure are trying to move the country away from plastics altogether. But first, South Africans dealt with a second consecutive night of scheduled power cuts on Wednesday as the state electricity company, Eskom, scrambled to replenish reserves to meet daytime demand. The unreliable utility is one of the biggest drags on the country's economic growth. Since 2007, it's been forced into several rounds of extensive outages. This week, though, a new CEO took over. Andre de Ruyter is overseeing the mammoth task of putting into place a government plan to restructure Eskom. Jane Flanagan joins us now with more. Jane, so we've had to take you on the phone because of the load shedding. It does seem like supply is getting worse rather than better. What is Eskom's plan?
Hi, Georgia. Yes, I'm speaking to you by candlelight from Cape Town, and it does seem as though Eskom is a metaphor for the failings of South Africa these days. I mean, just last week we had a record low availability of about 57% of capacity, and it's worrying because we're not really in a period of maximum usage. We're still very much in the long summer school holidays, and many businesses haven't come back after the holiday. That's all due to restart next week. Eskom has blamed, some poor weather for getting coal wet and some faulty equipment. But basically, the root cause of this is that Eskom suffered from a decade or more of gross mismanagement and corruption. And as you say, a new CEO will hopefully get things back on track.
So that new CEO you mentioned there is Andre de Ruyter. He stepped in a bit earlier into the role than planned. Why is that? And what are his priorities likely to be?
Well, to give you an idea of what he's looking at, I mean, he's described as having the worst job in South Africa, perhaps apart from worse even than Cyril Ramaphosa's job. But Eskom is now producing less electricity than it did in 2007, and yet it's got 3 times as many employees as it did back then. And so the production is down, and yet it's just got this inflated a number of staff, and that's something that the new CEO really is going to have to get on top of. But of course, it's a heavily unionized utility, so he's going to come up against some serious opposition. One of the biggest challenges is the unbundling of Eskom, to divide it into generation, transmission and distribution. But again, how can you crack eggs without breaking them? There simply won't be any tolerance for job losses. That's going to be something, a sacred cow he's going to have to slaughter quite soon.
So that's the prospects in the medium to long term. In the short term, as you mentioned there, we're seeing that it's failing to meet daily demand now. So what is likely to happen when the school term starts in earnest next week?
Well, I think we've come to terms with the fact that load shedding is not going anywhere. People are talking about the next 5 years, that this is going to be part of everyday life. I mean, at the moment, we're without power for 2 hours. But if things get worse, we're going to have multiple power outages every day or most days. So we aren't just going to lose 2 hours in the evening or 2 hours in the morning. We're going to lose a couple of hours at either end of the day. And it absolutely is going to kill business. This is the single biggest challenge facing this government. And, questions are asked, how is this government have any chance of turning around an economy when businesses are trying to cope with not keeping the lights on? People are investing in generators, alternative energy sources, but a lot of businesses just won't cope.
Thanks very much. Jane Flanagan there for us in Cape Town. Well, at dawn on Wednesday, here in Paris, the lifeless body of a stowaway was found in the landing gear of an Air France plane soon after it landed. It had taken off on Tuesday evening from Abidjan in Ivory Coast. It looks like the child, thought to be about 10 years old, snuck on board and died either from asphyxiation or the cold. Over the last few years, several young people from Africa have been found frozen to death or crushed in the undercarriage of western-bound planes. For more from Abidjan, here's our correspondent, Frank Hersey.
Of the stowaway are scarce, but reports from both ends of the flight suggest that it was a child. Abidjan Airport is right up against a poor neighbourhood, where kids often stand on bollards to watch the planes over the wall. It's not yet clear how somebody managed to access the airport and clamber up into the landing gear of the Boeing 777 before its Tuesday night flight across the Sahara. Speaking at Wednesday's Council of Ministers, the Minister for Communications focused on that issue of airport security.
An investigative commission led by the Civil Aviation Authority has been set up. This is the first time such an incident has occurred at our airport, and with great compassion but also with determination, the government will closely follow the progress of this case.
The Minister hopes that video surveillance footage will help investigators understand how somebody got right up to the plane. Thousands of people seek to migrate to Europe from West Africa each year, including lone teenagers, typically overland across the Sahara and then by boat from North Africa. The Ivorian government will be keen to make sure that others don't try to follow this stowaway's route.
Look now at some news in brief. 3 people were killed in a car bombing in Mogadishu in Somalia on Wednesday morning. Local extremist group Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for the attack. It happened as soldiers were carrying out searches at a checkpoint. That explosion follows a ramping up of Al-Shabaab attacks on neighboring Kenya. On Sunday, jihadist fighters overran a key US military base there. 3 Americans were killed. It was the first time such a target was hit. On Wednesday, the group warned Nairobi that it would never be safe and demanded that Kenyan forces would be withdrawn from the African Union peacekeeping mission in Somalia. In DR Congo's capital, protesting students were given a day to leave the campus of Kinshasa University. Violent clashes there this week have already left 1 policeman dead. The demonstrations are over the near doubling of tuition fees. Authorities have warned that anyone still found on site on Thursday will be considered an enemy of the Republic. More than 6,000 people have died in a measles epidemic in DR Congo. It is the world's worst, with nearly 3 times the number of victims of the Ebola epidemic that attracted widespread international attention last year. The WHO has said that an extra $40 million in emergency funding is needed to roll out an immunization drive for kids. The latest epidemic started last June, with a vaccination campaign launched in September. Botswana's opposition's been given leave by the Court of Appeal to try to have last year's general election results thrown out. A lower court had earlier rejected the UDC's petition to do so for lack of evidence, but that ruling was overturned on Wednesday. The UDC claims that the election that saw the ruling BDP party win a sweeping victory last October was marred by irregularities. Well, Kenya, like many developing nations, struggles with organised waste collection. That means efforts to deal with rubbish in a greener way are far from efficient. There, only about 30% of plastics are recycled. Most ends up in landfill sites. Some campaigners, though, say that prevention is better than cure and are trying to move the country away from the use of plastics altogether.
A drain in Nairobi clogged with mostly plastic bottles. Kenya produces 20,000 metric tons of plastic per year. In 2019, less than a third of that amount was recycled. In this recycling facility 30 kilometers southeast of Nairobi, the main problem is contaminated plastic waste.
One of the challenges we have in Kenya today is we don't have segregation at source. So at the level we are playing at right now, we have a lot of contaminated bottles. So it's very hard for us to actually recover bottle resin, recycled resin from the old bottles to put into new bottles.
Because recycling is not always efficient, some NGOs believe the best solution is to abandon plastic altogether.
What these corporations need to do is to invest in research and development and develop alternatives to plastic materials. Also, they need to invest more in refilling systems and reusing systems. For example, we used to have glass bottles here in Kenya that used to work very well.
Worldwide, 1 million plastic bottles are sold every minute. That's 500 billion purchased every year.
Well, that's it for Eye in Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
The world is ever-changing. The news doesn't wait. That's why at France 24, we'll always be there to help make sense of world events. For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what. France 24, with you everywhere, all the time. Liberté, égalité, actualité.